Okay, hi, I'm Bob Benson. I'm chair of the Perth and Kinross Integration Joint Board. I'd like to welcome you to a special meeting of Perth and Kinross Integration Joint Board on the 30th of May 2023. I'd like to ask Scott Hendry if he could provide us any apologies for the meeting. But before I do that, I'd also like to welcome Alistair Bailey, who will be coming in to do a deputation later on in the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, members. I can confirm we have apologies from Bernie Campbell, Dr. Lee Robertson, Dr. Emma Fletcher, Donna Mitchell, Stuart Hope, and also from Jackie Jensen. And we have Donald McPherson, who is substituting for Jackie Jensen as a voting member.
Thank you very much indeed. Any declarations of interest? Okay, thank you. I'll now move on to the item 3, which is the delivery of the general medical service at Invergowrie Medical Practice. And I'd like to welcome Alistair Bailey to make a statement, and then we will be able to ask him questions thereafter. Welcome, Alistair.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, committee members, and thank you for hearing my deputation today. I'm here today to give a voice to the people who don't own cars and therefore face having to trek almost an hour to their surgery on 2 buses while ill if the proposal is approved today. The report unfortunately glosses over that group, noting that in general the population of this practice is relatively affluent. For that very reason, the Scottish Government requires meaningful involvement according to the Health and Social Care Planning with People guidance. I don't, however, see any evidence that has happened in this case. A letter one Saturday morning is not meaningful involvement. It left a vacuum into which I threw myself, doing what I could to allay the fears and concerns of this community. What's worst here is that if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, there's no net change in the number of GPs happening. We should therefore question why there is any need to withdraw primary care services from Invergowrie. Why the need for any change when what precipitated this was a staffing shortage which the practice has now addressed? From a service user's point of view, it would be far better for the new GP to hold surgeries in Invergowrie. That aces the criteria set out in the paper before you today, but was not even assessed as an option, unfortunately. This is therefore centralisation, and people don't want that. They want the care to remain in their community. I took the time to speak with that community, and that's why I'm bringing this petition here with 566 signatures to your meeting. They're all in favour of keeping this provision locally. Many of these signatures were gathered on the street one rainy Thursday afternoon. That's right, these people came from their homes in the rain to come and sign this petition. This isn't a case of the typical online frustration venting clickfest. It's real people walking real yards in March rain to show their concern. Back to the journey people have to take to reach primary care services if this change is approved. It might only be 3.5 miles by car, but then there's limited parking at the other end. Not everyone has that luxury, or their ailment or treatment might preclude it. For public transport users, the options are far worse. Getting 2 buses and walking some too. If a person in Kingoody wants to attend Ancram Road, they face an hour's journey on 2 buses with a 20-minute wait in between in town. Compounding that, there's only 1 bus an hour, so it's going to take 3 to 4 hours depending on when the appointment is and whether it ties in with the buses. I wonder whether anyone here has undertaken that journey in the real world. I can tell you now, while ill or anxious, it won't be any fun. Direct management was good enough for 2 Dundee and Angus practices, so why not here? We're creating a deficit for the people of Perth and Kinross to the extent that central funding to NHS Tayside is being used to do that in 2 neighbouring areas, but in Perth and Kinross, surgeries seem to simply pass into the night without proper service user consultation or such interventions being fully assessed. I implore you, as fellow public servants, to act in the best interest of our community in Invergowrie, who we all serve, by requesting that instead the Ancram Road practice continues care from Invergowrie base, using the GP they've already recruited in the time since this closure notice was originally issued. Thank you for hearing me, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the community's wishes and concerns. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Alistair. And we now have an opportunity to ask questions. They're not usually as silent as this, I have to say. So any questions, please? It looks as though, Sandra, do you wish to ask a question?
I have a question.
And I think Ian seems to be waving his hand. He must have some technical issues. Sandra, do you want to ask a question, please? Thank you. You're on mute, sorry.
Not so much a question, just to say that I welcome the presentation, and I'm glad that the community have been given the opportunity to input into this. As an IJB, I don't feel that we have been given appropriate opportunity to input thus far. And would very much like to make the point that when we received the papers, this report on Friday, I immediately contacted the sender of the report to asking for clarification. Were these papers confidential, and if not, could I then send them to the reference group for comment?
Sorry, Chair, can I just jump in here, Sandra? I think this is maybe a point to bring up when we get onto the debating of the report. I think we're at the stage of questions to Bailey specifically on his deputation. Yeah, if you've got a point to raise on the papers, of course that's valid, and I think we should deal with that when we get on to the actual debating of the report, Chair.
Okay, so thanks for your intervention, Scott. It was more, as I say, to say that I was pleased about the opportunity for input, because I think that's been absent thus far. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I thought that Ian had been trying to come in, but perhaps he's got some technical problems.
Chair, there are indications in the chat from Sheila McCall and Councillor Colin Stewart. Councillor Sheila McCall and Councillor Colin Stewart have indicated a question.
All right, I can't see them on my screen. I'll take Sheila McCall and then Colin Stewart.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Alistair, for the deputation. That's quite insightful. Alistair, do you have any way of advising us how many of the signatories are current patients of the practice in Invergowrie?
I don't have that specific data, but the feeling I have from the conversations I had with people is that there's probably 3/4 are registered with Invergowrie at the moment, but the remainder all live within the catchment. Certainly that was a requirement, yeah. Okay,
no, I understood that, but that's great, Alistair, thank you.
Okay, Colin?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Bailey, you mentioned in your deputation about the planning with people guidance from the Scottish Government and COSLA, I think. People may not be familiar with that. I wondered if you could expand on what planning with people's meant to do and how it's meant to operate.
I'm maybe not the subject matter expert on that, with respect, but I think the core principle of it is that sorry, I did lift a few words from it. I'll just find those here. That there should be meaningful involvement from the community, meaningful involvement of the community in such decisions, and that's where I think there is the deficit here. That They received the letter in January. The letter said closure was definitely going to happen and said they would be issued a new GP. So it did at least reassure them that they wouldn't be left without a primary care service. But it essentially was in my view anyway, and in the views of many of the residents who spoke to me, it was as though a summary decision had been made and there was no further opportunity for any consultation. Obviously, a number of residents and myself did still contact the NHS and the Health and Social Care Partnership with questions. We did have those answered. And then there was latterly the agreement that there would be an options appraisal, which you have in front of you today. But that options appraisal was not informed by inputs from the community. There's been no community meetings, there's been no engagement, no surveys, questionnaires, etc. Councillor Stewart.
Thanks. And do you think that maybe a pause to this process to allow for that community engagement to inform our the IJB's recommendation and NHS Tayside's decision on this matter would be helpful?
Yes, it would be helpful because it could help in two regards. One, it could help people to better understand the journey that people have to undertake from Invergowrie to Ancrum by public transport, because that's the implication here. But also it would give breathing space for a wider strategic review of some kind of medical primary care provision for the Castle Gowrie, because as the report notes, the surgery at Errol, the Castle Gowrie practice, Castle Gowrie Medical Centre, sorry, is also in a temporary building, and we're overdue an assessment of the healthcare needs of this area. And it would be a shame for the patients of Invergowrie to be eradicated to Ancrum Road if that then undermines the business case in the future for a CAST-centric practice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Are there any further questions?
Can I just come back in, please, Chair?
Sheila, that's fine. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Alistair, I think it might be helpful for members of this board who are perhaps not as familiar with the regulations that you're referring to, and indeed the content of your deputation, if a copy can be shared so we can give it proper consideration. If you're able to do that just now, that would be great. Maybe put something in the chat.
Yeah, certainly.
Provide us some link. Yeah, if you can provide us some link and maybe upload the text of your deputation so we don't lose any of the content of it. Thank you.
Yes, I will do, certainly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think that's the end of questions. So, Alistair, I'd very much like to thank you for coming along today and to make the points that you have made. We take these very seriously, and we will deliberate on these, and perhaps some of these points may be fed back to NHS Tayside as part of their own deliberations. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chair. I'll switch to the live meeting alongside the public and continue to watch your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I'll wait until Bailey has left the meeting. Can you confirm that that is the case?
Yes, I think that's it. I'm now left the meeting, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I introduce our speakers on the substantive paper, I thought it would be helpful just to try and contextualise this a wee bit about what we're talking about today. Members will be aware that the Invergowrie Medical Practice intimated its intention to terminate the contract with NHS Tayside from the 23rd of June 2023. General Medical Services contractual arrangements are an administrative function of NHS Tayside Board. The long-term sustainability of primary care services is identified as a current strategic risk in Tayside and within the IJB Strategic Risk Register. The circumstances leading to the termination of the GMS contract for Invergowrie indicate how these difficulties are being experienced at practice level. The members should also be aware that the Perth and Kinross Integration Joint Board will be asked to approve an updated 3-year primary care strategic delivery plan and premises strategy for the period 2023 to 26 at its planned meeting on the 21st of June. This will set out a refreshed vision for primary care services and what is required locally to provide the appropriate infrastructure and workforce to achieve it. And I would hope that would incorporate how we would consult as well ongoing, as has been raised. The decision making in relation to the Invergowrie medical practice is complex for a number of reasons as set out in the papers today. So the report for consideration today will be presented by Dr. David Shaw, Associate Medical Director for Primary Care Services for NHS Tayside. Perth and Kinross and Dundee IJB have been asked to support and comment on the recommendation to NHS Tayside, which is to disperse the majority of patients to Ancrum medical practice and remaining patients to a small set of practices local to where they live. It is proposed that this will ensure all patients currently registered with Invergowrie medical practice continue to have access to high quality, person-centred and safe GP and primary care services. Comments from today's IJB meeting will be shared with NHS Tayside Board at a special meeting to be held on the 1st of June 2023. And I'm pleased to welcome David Shaw, Associate Medical Director for Primary Care Services, and Shona Hyman and Debbie McGill, colleagues from Primary Care Service, who are able to join us today to lead us through the report and the options appraisal. Thank you. David.
Thank you very much, Chair. Don't particularly like coming today. It's nothing against Perth and Kinross IJB. It's just, it's never a good thing when a practice closes. And unfortunately, that's something that I've experienced too frequently recently. Since 2004 within NHS Tayside, we've lost 11 practices, mostly initially through mergers as two smaller practices joined together. But over the course of the last few years, since 2018, we've lost Stobswell, Bridgeburn, Freakham, Rye Hill, and now we're discussing Invergowrie. Now, the situation within Tayside isn't unique to Tayside. It's not unique to Scotland. Scotland, over the same sort of time period, has lost 123 practices. We have taken over the running of 5 practices in the last 20 years, one of which has now been released back into the wild as a GMS practice, so independently run. The remaining 4 remain within NHS Tayside directly managed services, 2 in Angus and 2 in Dundee. So the background to the Invergowrie situation is one of general weakness within primary care. The IJB in Perth and Kinross should be credited for taking a front foot on this. They've invested in primary care. They have helped to spearhead a primary care sustainability survey. They have advocated for improved premises in primary care. So it is not that the IJB hasn't done significant work in this area already. It is just that the problem is so great that even that work hasn't been sufficient to sustain the kind of primary care that we would all like to see. Something that's local, something that's delivered with the intent of looking after a population who live near the surgery. So when Dr. Ip, who holds the contract in Invergowrie, approached us in late December to state that he wasn't able to carry on, as he was the sole remaining partner responsible for around about 6,000 patients between 2 different surgeries, and that the only way he saw of managing something out of that situation was to give up the Invergowrie contract. It was unfortunately not unexpected. You'll see in page 16 of the paper the various different considerations we then had to make in order to try and make sure that we had something that was the best fit if he determined to proceed to closure. So we were looking for services that ensured that patients registered within Invergowrie medical practice had access to high quality, person-centered, safe GP and primary care, that we could retain GP services within the local area, and that all patients within Dundee and Errol could have similar access to general practice, that it was an achievable solution, that it was viable over the longer term, it was consistent within the strategic direction for primary care services in Dundee and Errol, that it used the best use of resources and staff and space. And also there should be some financial assessment. Although I must say that finance had very little to do with the options that we considered. Essentially, our main aim was to try to retain something local for the community. It's a tragedy when a village loses its practice. We've experienced that in Freakham. We've experienced that in Bridge of Arn. It's very difficult. It's not something which we go into in a cavalier fashion. So the first step was to explore all different options available to us. We worked with Dr. Ip to see if we could bolster his team. He did manage to recruit an additional salary GP, but he remains the only partner, and his team is still not large enough to deliver comprehensive services over 2 sites. So whilst there is more time following that recruitment than there was at the start of this process, it is not sufficient to run 2 surgeries safely. We saw tenders from other practices to see whether or not we could have a solution within the village through that approach. That was unsuccessful. We had 3 notes of interest, but no one followed up with an actual bid. We worked with practices roundabout to see if any were content to have some form of merger, perhaps operate the surgery in reduced hours. And unfortunately, that didn't attract sufficient interest. After Dr. managed to successfully recruit and came in just about a month ago to say that he felt that he could provide continuity of clinician, if not of geography. We spoke with him to say, could you run some form of branch, given that a significant number of your patients will have issues getting to your surgery, and it would be prudent to have some form of local facility that, even if you used it a couple of days a week, would mitigate some of those transport inequities. He stated that he did not have sufficient clinicians at that time to undertake that, although he would look at it and review the situation in 6 months' time. And we are retaining the premises. General practice obviously goes beyond just your general practitioner. Primary care involves an MDT, and I think it's extremely important to see how best we can retain services of any kind within the village. I do, as I said at the start, feel that local communities should be served by local practitioners wherever possible, and that remains an ideal that we're committed to. The environment that we are in remains difficult. Part of the reason why this has been such a difficult process is that a Dundee practice towards the West End unfortunately closed last year. That's the Rye Hill surgery. They also cared for people all along the Carse, as do several other practices within Dundee. We absolutely do need to look at the resilience of the practices that remain. We have invested in making modifications to the Muirhead surgery, who look after around about 2,000 patients who live in the Carse area, to increase their clinical space. And we've made some modifications which should be coming through the system that should help the Carse short term. But of the longer term, there is absolutely a strategic requirement to invest in services for patients who live along the Carse. And I would be very keen to work with Perth and Kinross, to Dundee and Angus, who are also touched by similar resiliency issues towards their Southern Angus border, in order to try and protect, retain and improve services that patients experience. In summary, what you have is a process which is not as good as that thing that we had before. But unfortunately, the reality of the situation is we can't run a 2C practice in Invergowrie because we can't attract sufficient clinical cover in order to make that safe. We can't currently attract sufficient clinical cover to our existing 4 practices within Tayside when we have open adverts out. And in order to safely run services within Invergowrie, we require cover that goes beyond the requirements of having 1 GP, because we need to have safe holiday cover. And it is therefore an unsafe situation to state that we can continue services in the absence of an ability to recruit. That means that we expose patients to unsafe general medical services. Ultimately, my job as AMD is to ensure that every patient in Tayside has access to safe, efficient, locally provided general medical services. And unfortunately, I think the option that you see before you is the only safe way of doing that, that retains something local and something which hopefully can be expanded. And absolutely, I will continue to work to try and expand that back into the village.
Thanks very much, David. I now invite questions or comments.
There's a question in the chat, Bob, from Beth Hamilton.
Okay, Beth.
Hi, David. Thanks very much for that presentation. I just wanted to pick up on the potential of keeping the premises open, not solely for GP purposes, but the multidisciplinary team. I wondered if you could expand more on what that would mean, i.e. who would be managing that? Because at the moment things are under the control of the GPs in the practice, but if there's no GP there, but there are other clinics and we're looking at expanding the multidisciplinary team input to keep it for potential in the future, how will that be managed in the interim?
Currently, there's some care and treatment services delivered through Invergowrie Medical Centre. So these are services such as phlebotomy. It's a facility to have your blood pressure checked, perhaps to have other checks performed. That's currently something that Dundee Partnership provides. The MDT goes beyond that. We have community nurses, we have health visitors. So there are a range of additional options for how we could expand services in so that we could provide, I guess, a more local experience for the population. That, I think, involves ongoing partnership work between Dundee and Perth and Kinross to determine what set of services is that which is best placed. So we absolutely have a facility. We now need to work out how best to use it. It is our building, so I think we have choices, and we need to make the best ones for the local population.
And you know, when you're looking at that, you're saying we've got to make choices. You're looking at Bailey's paper, etc., and petition. Would that choice involve the local population then?
Absolutely. I think that part of the remit of the Integrated Joint Board is to provide a strategic direction for those services that they feel the residents of Perth and Kinross need. So I think it's a question of applying those principles to the population of Invergowrie. So what is it that the IJB would like to see within Invergowrie? There is the opportunity to use existing resources in a different way that provides a more local input. And I guess how that fits in with the IJB's priorities and how that fits in with the service constraints that sit around about existing services is very much for Perth and Kinross working with Dundee to plan through. So I think there is an opportunity, and it would be a useful thing to engage with that.
Thanks very much for that further clarity, David.
Thank you very much. I have Shona Hyman and then Jackie Pepper, Councillor Stewart and Deborah McGill.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Shona Hyman. I'm the manager for primary care in Dundee and obviously been involved in this process. I put Q, but actually I guess what I wanted to do was make a comment just to add to what David said in response to Beth. So the team do currently provide a range of care and treatment services, and also for people who are on warfarin, there's warfarin monitoring happening in Invergowrie, and the intention is that that would continue. And in fact, we've been having discussions as to whether we can increase that, and those discussions are ongoing, and that includes the NHS Tayside property team in terms of continuing the use of the building. I think particularly given, as David's highlighted, that if this option was approved at the practice, if they can increase their staffing, would look to expand and deliver in the future if they can do and had the capacity to. But for things that happen like warfarin, which are really regular, the intention would be that that would be able to be provided as it is at the moment in the village. There's some practical issues, and I wonder if that's what Beth was asking just in relation to that. So if you don't have the same team supporting the building, there's things like lone working we need to work through, ensuring that the cleaning contract's put in place. So there's some very practical discussions that we're having to ensure that that would be able to be delivered longer term. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jackie Pepper.
Thank you very much. And it was really just from the perspective of the Health and Social Care Partnership in Perth and Kinross to echo what David and Shona were saying around the importance of looking at not just the relationship with Dundee and the Health and Social Care Partnership and primary care services, but across the whole of the CARS, because there's also the ERL practice. So it's an opportunity here to stand back and look at the whole strategic needs of that local area across the piece. And we've already begun to identify some of the actions that we would take forward. And Chair, it's really just to say that some of that will be outlined in the paper that comes to the board in June. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colin.
Yeah, a few things that I didn't understand. So one of the criteria that was used in the assessment was about keeping GP services in the local area. I think I can think of 3, maybe 4, maybe even more GP practices that are closer to Invergowrie than Ancram. Is that local? Is Ancram Road local to Invergowrie, Kingoody and Longforgan?
Is that a question for David?
Well, it was David that covered what the assessment criteria are, but anybody else who was involved in the paper can answer.
I can discuss if you want.
Yes, David,
So,
thank you. Proceed.
Thanks. So I guess it's an interesting set of points. So absolutely what we want is something that's local. We are dealing with a population that extends over a significant area. So Invergowrie looks after many more people than those who are just inside the village. There are problems with some of the most local practices. So the closest practice to Invergowrie is Westgate Surgery. Westgate Surgery took 2,000 patients after Rye Hill closed. They're at capacity. There is no room. In terms of what is closest, as the crow flies, Ancram then sits pretty much as being amongst the next closest surgeries to the village itself. And certainly it does provide the continuity of clinician, which other surgeries that may be at a similar distance don't. So it is not as local as I would want it to be, but within the limits of its proximity relative to other surgeries, it is local.
Okay, thanks. And just a very two more, I think, but the first one very quick. Did I hear you correctly that the notification was received in, or the first intimation was received in December? Because that's not mentioned anywhere in the timeline in the paper. That would have been another month on top to, you know, I think as Mrs. Auld said, you know, this is the first input 2 weeks before the practice is due to shut. This is the first input that the IJB has had. It had something come forward prior, then we could have looked at other options. But it was December. Okay, that's clear. I want to just explore the no holiday cover issue, being unsafe. I don't understand that. In the situation where a single GP operating out of Invergowrie needs to go on holiday, wouldn't you just appoint a locum GP? What inherently makes lack of holiday cover unsafe?
There are no locum GPs. Speaking as a GP, you can see the surgery behind me. Actually getting one is very, very difficult. And we've certainly been in the situation within our 2C network where we have had situations where we've been very close to having no cover at all. And it is only through extreme effort that we've managed to retain any degree of safety within our services. It's not viable. In previous years, when I first started out, it was not really any bother at all to get a locum, but you can't get GPs to be substantive principals. That's part of the reason why we have the issue that we have in Invergowrie. It is very difficult to get GP locum cover, and to get GP locum cover in a single-handed practice is nigh on impossible. It's part of the reason why we have so few single-handed practices.
Okay, thanks. And just one other thing which has occurred to me, the Ancram Medical Centre, where this practice is based, also includes another GP practice, I understand.
Yep.
So there are two practices there, and it's now going to take on 1,800 odd patients from, or 1,500 odd patients from Invergowrie. What are the capacity constraints at the Ancram Medical Centre?
To my knowledge, there's sufficient capacity within the physical building to cover all patients from Invergowrie together with all patients at Ancram. So we are happy to work with the practice if any additional physical alterations are required. It's not been intimated to us as a necessity.
Okay, that's fine, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin. Deborah McGill.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to follow on from what David said to support what he said with regards to patients being aligned if they aren't going to Invergowrie, so going to Ancram. So when we conduct the process with regards to dispersal of patients, it's very much a patient-centred approach that we do take. And based on many patient feedback surveys, they would prefer to remain with the GP, their current GP. And in this instance, we have managed to do that for the majority of the patients. And for the other patients, we have managed to align them to practices as close to where they live as possible. So I hope that provides some reassurance that we do take a very much a patient-centred approach. We are hoping to work with health and social care partnerships, all three, specifically Perth and Kinross, in relation to what we can do for patient transport service going forward. And with regards to the challenges, yes, we really find it difficult, especially I'm also primary care services manager and responsible for the 2C practices. We find it extremely difficult to get locums there, and I believe that's throughout other practices throughout Tayside. We have 61 practices. We have got 23 vacancies currently within practices. Some have got more than one, and 17 of these have been open for over 6 months.
Thank you. Donald McPherson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, David. I mean, I've sat on this and other IJBs on a number of occasions when you've come along and brought one of these papers, and I know it's not something that you take any pleasure in doing, quite the reverse, but they are always very clearly thought through, and I know a lot of work is put in by you and your team to exploring all the options. But I was struck when Bailey spoke earlier about the challenges of transport and how many of the people in Invergowrie will find it difficult to get to another surgery. And I just wonder, have we given enough thought to, in particular, the opportunities that, well, one, that technology would give us. We now, since the pandemic, we've made much more use of Near Me so that we can offer remote surgeries. Have we looked, for example, at offering a hosted Near Me terminal in the building that we will still have in Invergowrie? And also, I believe there's a pharmacy in Invergowrie. Have we looked to see if it's already providing the full range of services that a pharmacy can provide, or are there more services that could be provided in this way, so that if we do accept what's proposed here and acknowledge that there will be additional travel needs, at least we can minimise the impact of these? Thank you.
Who wants to pick that up? I
can pick up elements of it if that's helpful. So absolutely, we've invested in NHS Tayside in Near Me. I use it in my surgery. It's very useful for people who are able to use a relatively straightforward piece of technology. I've been both a patient attending my kids' appointments and also a user. So certainly I think both ends work reasonably well. There's obviously an opportunity, and we need to work out what we're doing with the building in order to work out whether a Near Me suite would be an appropriate thing to do. But the technology, as I said, is already in place. All we would really need to do is to set up the webcam and the computer and work with the practice and identify the space and an appointment structure that would enable those sorts of things to take place. So there would be an operational requirement to do some investigatory work in order to bring that from we could do this to, and now operationally you can get Near Me appointments if you attend the practice on a Tuesday at 10:30, that sort of thing. And that's very much what I would expect P&K, Dundee and Ancram to work together over the next piece of time. So I think there is that. Do appreciate that there will be some patients who, for whatever reason, will find it easier to attend other practices than Ancram. And we have written out previously to Dundee practices to state that if there are particular frailty concerns or particular patient-centred reasons why an alternative practice would be better, that patients can go to where they would like to go to rather than go to Ancram. We think most people will probably go to Ancram because so much work nowadays is done either remotely through telephone or potentially through Near Me. I think that answered most of your points, but if I've left anything, I think Shona wants to come in. Actually,
the pharmacy question.
Pharmacy.
The pharmacy. Yeah, sorry, the pharmacy. There's a Boots in Invergowrie. I believe that the pharmacist in Boots is a prescribing pharmacist, and so there are a range of services that can currently be offered locally, and absolutely we would support any local development in that range.
Okay, is this a supplementary you want to expand upon, please? Is that Shona?
Yeah, it's just to clarify what David said. Everybody will be aware that pharmacy services are increasingly developing in terms of the role that the community pharmacy teams have in supporting people when they're unwell. And we're really lucky in Scotland that we've got a developing service. The pharmacist in the team in Invergowrie are very stable practice, which is different to in other areas, and I don't think the pharmacist there is a prescriber, but will be undertaking that training very soon. They've been prioritised for training. The pharmacy premises are quite small, and there's been some work going on, I think, with the premises, but the prescribing element is due to develop, and that will help to enhance local provision of services as well.
Thank you very much. Sandra Auld.
Thank you, Chair. There are so many aspects of this topic that are worthy and necessary of discussion, but on a kind of wider strategic level, I wondered how many of the practices locally are training practices, and if there had been sort of specific attention perhaps paid to or focused on trying to retain trainee GPs moving forward within those practices as you know, thinking of recruitment and retention.
Just coming back on that, Invergowrie and Ancram aren't training practices. Ancram used to be a training practice, but isn't anymore. The other Ancram surgery is a training practice. Westgate, which is next to Invergowrie, is a training practice. We have a number of training practices in Perth. There's about a third of Tayside practices are now training GPs, and more than that are taking FY2s, so doctors who are in their first 2 years post-qualification, who are picking up additional experience. You're absolutely right to identify that being a training practice is positively associated with better resiliency, and absolutely my advice to any practice that's struggling at the moment would be to consider training. If you don't have young doctors going through your system, then you are much more likely to find that you will not be able to replace retirements when they come.
Yeah. Can I just come back? So thank you very much for that. That's really helpful information. So is that something that we as an IGB could aim to better support, as in the practices to become training practices? You know, is that something that we could be doing something about?
I think there's certainly things that could be done that would assist with training, which fall within the remit of the IJB. So in order to be a training practice, you need to have sufficient space, you need to have sufficient equipment, and that may involve review of the premises strategy to enable that in specific locations. There may be the opportunity to invest in particular locations where you feel that there's some degree of weakness, to encourage either the uptake of training or alternatively the preposition of newly qualified GPs. We do have a resiliency program within NHS Tayside called the Career Start, which takes doctors in their first 5 years post training for 2-year fixed term positions. And we try and locate these in practices that are particularly vulnerable. We're looking to see whether or not any in the CARS area would be beneficial now that we've had this weakness come through. We use the sustainability survey as a tool to identify where need exists. To date, we've had 50 career starts go through NHS Tayside. It's won several different awards. The Scottish Government is looking at it to see whether or not there are wider lessons. A variety of other regions have copied it. So there are useful things we can do with young doctors, both in training and immediately post-training, that can enhance sustainability.
Thank you for that. And Sandra, I'm also conscious of the note you'd sent us about Ian and making specific suggestions about robust transport needs assessment. I will get Jackie Pepper to contact him to garner that information, which we will also feed back to NHS Tayside. I'm conscious of time now, and I'd like to move on to Hamish Dougal. Thank you, Hamish.
Hi, Bob. Just a couple of comments. Firstly, on the Career Start, picking up after Sandra's comment and David's response. One of the problems with the Career Start, it's been a very successful programme, is it doesn't have a sound financial footing. So that is something that as an IGB we may wish to discuss. The training practices is another very well made point. There is a paradox that the busier that are, it's more difficult to find the time to invest because it's quite a time-consuming thing to do. And in fact, some practices are giving up training because they just don't have the time and resilience to do it. And the last point was really picking up on Colin's comment earlier, which Debbie I think covered in terms of locum availability. That's not just Dundee and Angus that's difficult. Perth and Kinross has got a real issue getting locums right across many practices. We've got 2 practices in Perth City, large, well-organised practices who currently have temporary list closures to new patients because they just do not have the medical workforce or the locum availability to it. And there's another practice where the doctors are talking about cancelling their summer holidays because there just isn't the locums available. So it is a real problem day to day for many practices to get that cover, which was readily available a number of years ago.
Thanks very much indeed. Councillor Sheila McCall.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, you made a reference at the start of this discussion about a paper, I think you said on a property strategy coming forward.
Yes.
And is it just a property strategy?
No, I think it's more, maybe Mrs. Pepper could give us a bit more information about that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. There are 2 papers coming forward on the 21st of June, Councillor McCall. The first one relates to our primary care strategy, and the second is about the premises strategy to support that. But Hamish may want to say a few words on that if time allows. But those are 2 separate papers.
No, I just wanted to make sure that's what I wrote down. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't misheard. Yeah. So in that case, thank you. I have a question for Dr. Shaw, if that's okay. I think the timing of this is a little bit unfortunate, given that the notice to quit is from the 23rd of June. And I'm just wondering what conversations, if any, we've had to try and delay that end point so we have time to consider the papers coming forward at the end of June to the IJB.
I don't think there's a facility to do that. I've approached Dr. Ip on a number of occasions seeking extensions, and he's not at all minded. So I have specifically asked for extensions previously, and I've had a very specific no.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Martin.
Right, Bob. The question of the pharmacy was interesting, and the use of pharmacy first is beginning to grow. Would there be opportunities within that premises if the pharmacies within the area is too small to place a pharmacy within that and expand it in that surgery? And would this be permanent closure or giving up the contract, or should circumstances change in the distant future? I wouldn't know, say in the not too distant future, but in the distant future, can there be then reapply?
So you've got 2 separate points there. I think the point one is, could you have a pharmacy inside Invergary Medical Centre? It's probably not ideal for that. It's a relatively small constrained site. You already have a pharmacy in the village. I think other solutions in terms of expanding the footprint of the existing pharmacy would probably be preferable. The second one is there a route back to having a full surgery? The temporary more achievable is to have a branch surgery, and we'll be working with Dr. Ip to see if that can be achieved. In theory, you could set up a de novo practice, but setting up a new practice is really rather difficult. You need to have sufficient cover. But in terms of can you put out a contract and see if people go for it? Yes, you could. You would probably require a sea change in the volume of GPs. So I think you're really talking longer term. So over a 10-year horizon, it's possible that now that we're training more GPs, if we can fix the retention side so that we don't bleed them, they don't all decide to go off to Canada and Australia, as I think about a third of our newly qualified GPs ultimately end up doing, then we could re-advertise a contract at some point in the future. It's just over the shorter term, no one would take such a contract.
Okay. I'm really struggling for time now, and I've got two more questioners. Sandra, could you be very fast, please? I really want to bring in Michelle Frampton.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. So I'm also conscious that we're going to be the committee are going to be asked to vote, I presume, on this report, and I would suggest that we're not in a position to be able to do that because this hasn't been consulted on properly. And the point I started to make at the very beginning, which was I asked, was it okay to share these papers with the reference group to seek wider opinion? And I'm still awaiting a response. The papers were circulated, but only yesterday, to the reference group, and that's not anything like enough time on, particularly on something of this importance. So I would strongly suggest that we, as an IJB, are not in a position to vote on this because it hasn't been consulted upon.
There is a question as to whether we need to vote at all, actually, Sandra, which I discussed prior to the meeting. Councillor Frampton.
Hello. I just wanted to ask David Shaw, you had said when you were speaking that you were pretty certain that the majority of patients would be happy to go to the Ancram practice. Can you tell us what evidence you have to support the assertion that the majority of patients will move to Ancram?
Certainly, we have heard anecdotally from many of Invergary's patients how content they are with the surgery. If you have a look at the health and care experience results from Invergary, it supports that they value their clinical team. What they are retaining is a clinical team. What they are losing is geography. And absolutely, I believe that people will put the ongoing continuity of care with their existing clinical team higher than the geography in most cases. There will be some cases where that is not the case. And absolutely, I'm under no apprehensions that this is not as good as people had before the medical practice intimated that it was going to close. So is this worse than you had? Yes. Is it the best thing that we can do given the situations that we find ourselves in? Unfortunately, I think so. So that I'm sorry, I can't really give you more detail on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring us to the recommendations within the report, and you will see that they are for noting. I'm mindful of what Sandra also just said to me, but I need to get the consent of the board if they are content to note these recommendations, and that would include the dispersal option as set out in Appendix 1. Are you content with the recommendations set out in the cover paper by the Chief Officer?
Chair, can I just interject just to clarify in terms of the process? So what obviously the recommendations 1 to 3 are to ask the IGB members to note the various aspects of the report, and then I guess the board needs to give a steer in relation to recommendation 4 about providing feedback, is whether the board is providing feedback to endorse the report to NHS Tayside board or something different. So I think just in terms of clarity, we need to ask the board to confirm that or not.
So if I could just further clarify that fourth bullet point, would that mean that we could also recommend to NHS Tayside that they pause the process as raised?
That would be a competent recommendation from this board. Obviously, the decision rests with NHS Tayside board, and it would be them to decide whether that is something that they could do. But in terms of the feedback, then this board can formally decide on the feedback that it wishes, and then it would be up to NHS Tayside board to take that into consideration when making its decision on Thursday.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I have Colin Stewart. Colin, I would like to be able to garner all of the questions and comments that have been received, including this last point. Where would you stand on that, Colin, before we decide what we're going to do?
Well, I was going to provide some points of feedback that I think, in terms of the recommendation or the request for us to provide feedback for NHS Tayside board to take into account on Thursday. I was going to provide some feedback which I think might be helpful. Firstly, if the recommendation is accepted, it is going to leave the entire Carse of Gowrie without a permanent GP practice, in the sense that there is a GP practice in Errol, but it is in a porta cabin, for want of a better word. At the time that happened, there was to be a strategic needs assessment done, and I think the Chief Officer referred to that earlier. I think this makes it all the more important that strategic needs assessment, strategic health needs assessment for the Carse of Gowrie is completed. So I'd like to add that in as a comment and possibly an action for our own health and social care partnership. I note that in the NHS Tayside budget meeting in April, the capital investment in the Errol GP surgery was deprioritised, and I think given this situation, this should certainly revisit that decision. I'm not content with the with various aspects. I'm not content with the timing of this meeting and recommendation. I'm not content because of the points discussed earlier. I'm not content with the lack of consultation with the local community. Previously, when major changes were proposed, we would have had the Cell 4 guidance. We've had to do a Cell 4 consultation. The Cell 4 was replaced with that planning with people, community engagement and participation guidance that Bailey referred to. I've managed to get a copy here in front of me, and that's not been done. So there's been no communication or consultation with the local community, other than them, as Bailey said, getting up and on their hind legs and going out and signing his petition, which is not taken account. It's mentioned, but their views are not taken account of in this. I'm a bit concerned that we've got a graph in the NHS Tayside paper in section 2.2, chart 1, the practice characteristics, showing that practice size has grown consistently from 2005, and that therefore we haven't, with the only drop off happening since I think the closure of the practice was mooted. But that growing size hasn't led to a recognition that we need a sustainable practice there. And I'm really concerned as well that if we actually look at what the options appraisal tells us, the options appraisal is essentially Appendix 2, and it's a table with 1, 2, 2A, 3, 4 and 5 in it. And in those summary boxes, there must be about 250 words. That's essentially all the options appraisal it contains. So we're proposing to remove a GP practice from a vibrant pretty self-contained community. I'm very familiar with Invergowrie. I'm very familiar with the West End of Dundee and Ancram Road type area. We're proposing to do it on the basis of a very scant options appraisal, which, as I've said, didn't include consultation with the community. And I think that we should recommend to NHS Tayside Board that they do a 2C, that they do a direct management of the practice. We are still in Perth and Kinross IJB. I think Bailey was wrong about this. It's not monies that go to NHS Tayside to support those. It's actually monies from the IJB, Perth and Kinross IJB, that are currently supporting 2C practices in 4 2C practices in Dundee and Angus. We've lost Bridge of Erne, but we've also lost branch surgeries in Blair Athol and I think somewhere in the Stanley Bank Foot area. I might be wrong about that. But we've never had the help to direct run a 2C practice in the Perth and Kinross area when we clearly need it. So I think our recommendation should be to take over direct management of the practice until you know, a more sustainable solution can be found and that proper community consultation could be done. Thanks.
And just to clarify, would that be setting aside the option appraisal that was recommended within the report? Or are you recommending that there are 2 for consideration?
I don't think that you can sensibly move all of the patients from Invergowrie up to Ancram Medical Centre and then expect that in 6 months' time there will be a situation where you can reverse it. I think that would be unnecessarily disruptive. So direct management at this point in the interim would be a better solution. Yes.
Just a couple of points that I need to just add here is that from Deborah McGill is that Dundee IGB support the recommendation made. So that's in the chat box. My sense is that, David, do you want to come into this? Because
Absolutely.
We could literally just feedback this information to the board and not have to make any judgment call or one against the other, but just simply to impart that there are strong views about the future of this particular practice. And there have been quite a lot of rightful concerns, I think, from transport to pharmacy to a range of different issues. So do you want to say something briefly before I move to pick this up?
Firstly, I'd certainly say that the feedback that I've got so far is that Perth and Kinross IJB deplores the closure of practice in a vibrant, growing community in Invergowrie. It regrets the decision to close the practice and feels that this is counter to the strategic interests of the population it looks after. So I think I've got that as being a fairly clear thing from the board.
Can I ask, I suppose the question, David, is it achievable and safe coming back to the recommendations?
Yeah, my next bit is I cannot run operationally a 2C practice in Invergowrie. I don't have the doctors. If we tried to keep it open just now, I couldn't recommend that as being a safe option. You potentially leave 1,776 patients without a doctor. Clinically, I think that's a very foolhardy decision to make. I regret that we're in that situation, but realistically, you can state that you would have preferred to see a 2C option if that had been viable. It's not viable, and I would welcome anyone who wishes to try and run one in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So that is ultimately NHS Tayside's decision to make. But what I will be saying at NHS Tayside Board is that it's nothing that is achievable in a safe way, and it is likely to result in patient harm. So I couldn't support it.
Thank you.
If that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Scott, can you advise us on how we could proceed here?
Yeah, Chair, I'm happy to, and although I notice Martin has a question on protocols, so it may be
Maybe
helpful to
it's the
take that
same.
question.
Maybe it's the same question. Question on protocol, briefly, Martin.
Yes, my understanding is IGBs have responsibility for primary services. So are we recommending on behalf of the IGB? I'm unsure how this lies, because it's NHS problem issue. It's the IGBs have responsibility for primary care.
I think we're now getting into technical questions about who's going to make the decision on this. Jackie, can you advise us on this, because it's been made clear to us is that the NHS Tayside will make a decision about this on Thursday.
Yeah, I think this is something that we've rehearsed a number of times in advance of this because of the complexity that we're facing here. And I think it might be helpful if Debbie McGill could outline the agreement for this particular decision and how that will likely change going forward. Debbie, you set that out beautifully earlier. I wonder if you could advise the IJB, please.
Is Debbie
Apologies, there? Jackie. Yes, I'm here. Sorry, Chair. So I'm just bringing up the email, and I'll just read from the email, Jackie. So with regards to the governance, there has been a review of the process with Margaret Dunning, and it has been agreed that it is the IGB's role to direct the board of the need to provide primary care in an area, and it is for the Health Board, through its Director of Primary Care, to determine how it's delivered, as the integration agreement excludes responsibility of professional advisory, contractual and administrative functions. It is recognised that it's important to consult and engage with the respective IGBs and health and social care partnerships, and therefore we, the boards, seek their support on the proposed course of action rather than require them to make a recommendation. That said, as the approval process has been clarified during the live situation with Invergowrie, we agreed at ELT that this paper needed to go to the board. In future, the current situation, a paper to the board, will not happen. We will seek the support of respective IGBs and HSCPs, and the paper will go to ELT. And I can certainly share the reference with regards to Margaret Dunning's governance email around all of that, if that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Scott, that takes us back to the question I posed at the beginning.
So yes, I think in terms of process, where we go from here, there's potentially two options for this board at this time. Is we could seek to get an agreed consensus of a formal position from the whole board to provide to NHS Tayside board for their meeting on Thursday, or we've obviously got various points of feedback from individual members that the chief officer could list in terms of various points of feedback. So it's whether you want to seek to pursue a collective single response from the board, or whether you wish the chief officer to summarise the various viewpoints of board members to pass on to the NHS Tayside board.
I think my preference is for a collection of all of the views rather than one single view, because there may be different viewpoints on the nature of what service is available. I'm very mindful of what David has said is about what was being proposed laterally was not viable, and I have to hear that because he's in charge of those areas. So for me, it's about imparting to NHS Tayside, and I think not just about the deliberations we're having today, it's about the whole processes that led up to the IJB being in a position where it's having to make really complex decisions here in a very short time frame, as being well highlighted, without the normal kind of supports that we would have done. But that apart, I think we need to gather all of the comments, and they would be my preference as a way of recognising all the inputs that have been made so far. And that would be my preference rather than going for one single outcome. Because the recommendations were simply asking us to note, and that's a different business. And that's a point I sought to clarify earlier on, as you know. So my sense is that we gather the information that we've got today, including some of the stuff that's come out of the chat line as well, and there's more and more coming through as we talk today. And I would rather that is put forward to the meeting with NHS Tayside fairly robustly on Thursday. And I can assure you that it will be, and some of the members here will be present for that. But I think the written report that Mrs. Pepper's going to gather, I would like that report to be circulated round this board so that we have a chance to make comment on it, if it's possible to do that before Thursday. I need your assent to that approach. Does that sound reasonable?
No, that sounds good to me. I don't know about anybody else.
Thank you, David.
Chair, can I just add one? I mean, we've had discussions around this, and I can't remember. I think it was Beth who raised the question about technology, maybe not. And we haven't really explored, and it isn't one of the options, to keep the premises open with perhaps a nurse-led service, or even with an option for patients to be able to communicate via video consultations. So I think that needs to be part of the comment feeding back, because for many people the access technology isn't necessarily that easy. But if we have, there are possibly nurse-led services that could be supported from there in the interim, at least until the full strategic papers come forward on both the provision of services and the strategy document on premises.
I couldn't agree with you more, Sheila. And in fact, if I'd been sitting with the group today, that's the very point I would have made as well. But today as chair, I've just not had time to impart that. And can I suggest that if we take the way forward, as I think I've suggested, it does seem to have some support, we put an additional comment, because, as you say, we've had to do this under time duress, I would say, to Mrs. Pepper to gather this information. And if that can be done as speedily as possible, then we will convey all of that information back to NHS Tayside Board. Because I think there's quite a lot of this, in many ways, there's quite a lot of work can be done with the practice moving forward that would pick up on some of those things. And indeed, Sheila, I think it might give some priority to some of these areas like digital solutions. Absolutely. And indeed to what does a community transport option look like, for example. So there are many unanswered questions.
I think, Chair, closing the building altogether, I think, would be a worrying prospect when we have the opportunity, since we own the premises, of maintaining some degree of services there, and it would keep that continuity. To see David nodding there as well. And I think for me anyway, from the discussion, I mean, obviously, as you know, and others know, we sit on the health board as well, so I'm being mindful that I have two different roles here, but my role here in this IGB is very clearly that I would like to see the premises maintained. I would like to see some level of clinical services offered, either through nurse practitioners or whatever, even if it was on a part-time basis, at least it would be somewhere, and where people where patients could come and access some of the digital solutions that exist in a private setting and in a medical setting, rather than necessarily have conversations from their own homes, when that might not always be possible for privacy and confidentiality reasons. Sure. So I think that should, if everybody else agrees, I think that should be one of our bigger feedback. And I see Martin waving there, so I'm presuming he's wants to come in.
Just Sheila, I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, the wider point that Mrs. Pepper made about premises assessment is another part of that exercise as well. I think it's fundamental we keep these premises and that we're able to continue to utilise and expand their usage with a range of other options. It may not be a GP, but it could be other options as well. Jackie, do you want to finalise this? There's more stuff coming through.
Chair Martin's been waving his hand about for a while, Martin.
I know, but Martin, it needs to be awfully brief.
It's very brief. I'm supporting your recommendations. That shall be forward.
Okay, thank you. Jackie.
Yeah, I'm happy to take things forward as you suggest, and for which there's been quite a bit of support in terms of the collation of the points raised. I'm not going to rehearse that just now. Yeah. We don't have time to do that. And we've got a short time in which to summarise those for the NHS Tayside Board on Thursday, and happy to circulate that in advance for very quick turnaround for comment. But I wanted just to give some reassurance that there isn't any indication of closing the premises altogether. In fact, quite the reverse. The report outlines the importance of retaining primary care services within the building, and we will, from a Perth and Kinross Health and Social Care Partnership perspective, do as much as we possibly can to work with our partners to ensure that that continues. And in fact, I know from David's paper and discussion with him that the Ancram Medical Practice is still interested in coming back to use the premises even on a very part-time basis in the future. So that door needs to be remain firmly open. I do wonder whether there's something, Chair, about providing a quick update for IGB members on some of the key points that have been raised that they feel needed to be explored further. Once we have a plan to take those forward and to keep you appraised of the outcome of those. So I can't outline that just now. We don't have time to do that, but I do think there's something about bringing some of the key points that have been raised around consultation, engagement, some of the strategic needs assessment and transport pharmacy issues and technology that we need to keep the Perth and Kinross IGB appraised of, and we could find a mechanism for doing that. Thank you.
And thank you very much for that. And I would just end in saying this, as we go through this process of these changes, and we've noticed the Carsov-Gowrie population is like to expand, we need to be communicating with this community about the changes that are happening and how we can how they can be part of some of the solutions that we've been talking about, as has been strongly suggested at the meeting. I'm very grateful for everyone's comments, and I'm really sorry about the short timescale that we've had to deal with this. And one of the issues I've taken up with Mrs. Pepper is this issue about we will be faced with situations like this in the future, and we need to know not just with our strategy, but what will be the processes, how will option appraisals be conducted, and what kind of feedback will we expect to get, and who will be involved. Various things there as learning from this particular experience as well. And we might utilise that as a development session in particular, Jackie, given the importance of such a touchstone issue as this is. I'm very grateful for everybody's input today, I really am. Thank you, David. Thank you, your colleagues, and I've lost your names in all the middle of this, but thanks very much indeed. Very grateful. I'll now close the meeting. Thank you.